Testing 1 2 3, testing 1 2 3. This is Radio Free Mormon on the air, broadcasting behind enemy lines. Tonight's episode, how Joseph Smith came up with the olive tree allegory. Now, most of you know that the olive tree allegory to which I refer is found in the Book of Mormon. More specifically, it is found in Jacob, chapter 5 in the Book of Mormon. It is also the longest chapter in the Book of Mormon. So we're going to be talking about this olive tree allegory today, and we're going to be giving ideas as to how it was that Joseph Smith likely came up with this allegory and what his sources were for coming up with this allegory. Here's the title screen for today's show. It's episode 17 in the Mormon Sunday School series in Radio Free Mormon. It is episode 349. It is titled Mormon Sunday School with Radio Free Mormon, so you know that it's not supposed to be a faith promoting podcast. This is not faith promoting. This is knowledge promoting. This is a truth promoting podcast, not necessarily faith promoting, where you learn stuff you're never going to hear in regular Sunday school. So that should be another clue. How Joseph Smith came up with the allegory of the olive tree, lesson number 17. Let's get going on this, shall we? This is going to be a lot of fun. Here's our title slide. How Joseph Smith came up with the allegory of the olive tree. Now, I'm going to give a synopsis of the olive tree allegory right now. I went back and I read Jacob chapter 5 yesterday. I read it carefully. I made a number of notes. I'll be sharing some of that with you today, but we can synopsize this very easily. It's not always easy to comprehend what's going on in Jacob chapter 5 because it is a bit sprawling. It's a bit wordy. But if we take the 20,000-foot view, it is a play in 4 acts. And each of these acts is relatively simple to remember. Act 1, Israel is a tame olive tree who grows old and the branches begin to decay. Branches from wild olive trees, those are of course the Gentiles, branches from wild olive trees get grafted into the mother tree. By the way, I'm going to continue to refer to this original tame olive tree that represents Israel as the mother tree throughout because it gets a little bit confusing in Jacob chapter 5 in this regard. The bad branches are cut off the mother tree and burned, and young branches from the mother tree are planted in ground far away in the vineyard. Now there's an intermission, and a long time passes. The next act, Act 2, the mother tree with the wild branches grafted in produces good fruit. Other trees that are planted from good branches of the mother tree, remember in the various parts of the vineyard, they're also doing well, even though planted in bad spots of ground. Remember that part. But one of these other trees was planted in a good spot, but half good and half bad fruit. So when the vineyard owner and his servant comes back after this long pause, right, they find everything's doing spectacularly well. Everything's growing great. Everything has great fruit on it. The mother tree, the other branches that were planted in different parts of the vineyard to create different trees from the mother tree, right? Scattering of Israel. We'll have the gathering of Israel later, but this is the scattering part. But what Joseph Smith is doing is there's one tree that was planted in a good spot of ground, not the original tree, but broken off of the original tree. And this is an obvious reference to the Nephites and the Lamanites because the fruit is half good and half bad. That's the only one that has any bad fruit on it here, is the Lamanites in the Book of Mormon. So we have an intermission. Once again, a long time passes. And we have Act 3. Now, the vineyard owner comes back after this long pause and he finds that whereas in Act 2, everything was going great, in Act 3, everything's going crappy. Act 3, the mother tree has nothing but bad fruit. All other trees have nothing but bad fruit. Everything's going bad. Even the tree with half good and half bad is now all bad. And that's the Lamanites destroying the Nephites, of course. Now, a huge cross-grafting program is commenced, with branches from the mother tree grafted into the other trees and branches of the other trees being grafted into the mother tree. It is a huge cross-grafting program. There's no intermission here. No long time passes in the text. But this cross-grafting program, we find out in Act 4, was a huge success. Yay, cross-grafting. Bad branches gradually cut off the mother tree, not all at once, but gradually as they make way for the good branches to grow in. This is so that the branches do not overgrow the roots on which the branches depend. Now, all the trees in the vineyard are bringing forth fantastic fruit, And the allegory of the olive tree in Jacob chapter 5 comes to a happy, happy ending. So that is the olive tree allegory in thumbnail form, a play in 4 acts. It's really not that complicated for me when I broke it down. It was much simpler than I expected it to be. So this is what is going on. This is the action of the allegory. Now, I also noted that there is a structure in the allegory that is reminiscent of the endowment, and indeed, of course, the Book of Mormon being written in 1829 and the endowment coming, in the 1840s, I would expect. We understand that the Book of Mormon comes before the endowment, but this kind of pattern, this relationship between characters in the Jacob allegory of the olive tree, it was so similar to what happens in the endowment that I can't help but think that this is forming a basis for part of that. In other words, even as we can see the Joseph Smith translation commencing within the pages of the Book of Mormon, when he is doodling and restructuring and revamping different Bible books being quoted in the Book of Mormon, we can also see the incipient or nascent endowment structure here in Jacob chapter 5. Remember, the temple endowment ceremony is structured around 3 divine beings, Elohim, Jehovah, and Michael. Elohim gives commandments to Jehovah and Michael to go down to the earth and do something. They go and do it. They come back and repeat what it is that they have done. Jacob chapter 5, verses 29 and 30 states, "And the Lord of the vineyard said unto his servant, Come, let us go down into the vineyard." Yeah, it actually says, let us go down. And the vineyard is the world, allegorically speaking. So let us go down into the vineyard that we may labor again in the vineyard. And the Lord of the vineyard and the servant went down into the vineyard. See how that's somewhat reminiscent of the basic pattern of the temple endowment, at least the first half of the endowment. And then in chapter 5, verse 70, it says, "And the Lord of the vineyard sent his servant, and the servant went and did as the Lord had commanded him." All of this is reminiscent of what happens in the endowment. Now, this is just a random thought that happened to strike, and I wanted to make a slide about it. Let's go on now and talk about how the allegory of the olive tree uses some unusual verbs. And here I'm thinking of dung and cumber. Now, dung, of course, can be a noun, but it's used as a verb unusually in Jacob chapter 5. As part of nourishing the trees, they also dig them and dung them. And cumber is the second word, cumber. All sorts of fruit cumber a tree in verse 30, and more often dead branches are burned so as not to cumber the vineyard itself or the ground of the vineyard. For example, verse 10. By the way, an example for using dung in this allegory is verse 47. They appear more times than this. These are just examples of these 2 unusual verbs being used in the allegory of the olive tree. Please remember those 2 verbs, dung and cumber. We will meet them again. Now I'm going to do an examination of antecedents for the parable of the olive tree. In other words, what was existing in Joseph Smith's mind as of the time he would have commenced writing or dictating this allegory of the olive tree. And here I have the synopsis that's in the Book of Mormon, the synopsis before Jacob chapter 5. You can read that there. We've already gone over it in a bit more detail in the prior slides, in the play, in 4 acts. So here's some antecedents. Oh, this is going to be a little bit difficult to read. I apologize. This is what happened when it processed my slide in order to display it here. Yeah, it looked better before. But from Luke chapter 13, verse 6, here's an antecedent for the parable of the olive tree. Here's the first one. It says, number 1, Luke 13. And in Luke 13:6, it says, "He spake also this parable." This is talking about Jesus. Jesus spake also this parable. A certain man had a fig tree. Now, this is a fig tree, not an olive tree, but a fig tree planted in his vineyard. And he came and sought fruit thereon and found none. Then said he unto the dresser of his vineyard. So wait a second. There's a man who owns the vineyard, and there's another servant, and there's another man who's a servant of the first man, who is the dresser of the vineyard. This sounds a little bit like Jacob chapter 5, doesn't it? Then said he unto the dresser of his vineyard, Behold, these 3 years I come seeking fruit on this fig tree, and find none. Cut it down. Why cumbereth it the ground? Wait a second. That word sounds familiar and unusual at the same time. It's the word cumber being used as a verb. Why cumbereth it the ground? So here's this unusual word, cumber, being used in this parable in Luke chapter 13, and then it shows up again in Jacob chapter 5 in the Book of Mormon. The unusualness of this word gives it additional significance. It acts in the form almost of a fingerprint, showing that this is where Joseph Smith got this word to use in his parable. It's from another parable. It's in the Bible. It's in the New Testament. It's in Luke. It's in chapter 13. And there, in a parable being attributed to Jesus, he talks about a fig tree and talking about it's not bringing forth fruit and telling his servant, therefore, the person in the parable telling his servant, cut it down. Why cumbereth it the ground? If you've got a word like cumber that's so unusual in the Bible, and a word like cumber that is so unusual in the Book of Mormon or any of the other standard works that Joseph Smith produced, that connection becomes stronger. And now what makes it doubly strong is the fact that it is not only one unusual word as a verb, but two, because we have dung as well as a verb being used in the same parable in Luke chapter 13. The next verse says, verse 8, and he answering said unto him, Lord, let it alone this year, also till I shall dig about it and dung it. That's dig about, which happens in the olive tree allegory, as well as dunging it. We also have the servant talking back to his master and giving him different ideas, which the master appears to accept, just as in Jacob chapter 5 as well. But I'm focusing on cumber and dung, not just one very unusual word, but two in the same allegory here in Luke, and they show up over here in Jacob chapter 5. These are two fingerprints left at the scene. They go right back to the New Testament. And it concludes, and if it bear fruit, well, and if not, then after that, thou shalt cut it down. Yeah, just like the trees in the Book of Mormon get cut down and then burned. The idea of burning is not in this particular parable. This is only the first antecedent, and some of them will be shorter and some will be longer. But all of these antecedents were in Joseph Smith's hands as of the time he wrote the Book of Mormon, as of the time he wrote Jacob chapter 5. The second antecedent is Romans chapter 11. This is rather lengthy, where in Romans 11, Paul the apostle gives an allegory about, guess what? An olive tree. Let's see what it says. Romans 11:13, for I speak to you Gentiles. Okay, so Paul speaking to the Gentiles in Rome, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office, if by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are of my flesh, i.e. Jews, and might save some of them. For if the casting away of them, the Jewish people, be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? For if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root be holy, so are the branches. Okay, now he's starting to talk about root and branches, and here he segues in to his parable. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, talking to the Gentiles, remember, and thou being a wild olive tree. So the Gentiles are a wild olive tree. And if thou, being a wild olive tree, wert grafted in among them, whoa, he's talking about grafting. Sound like Jacob 5, anybody? Were grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. So the root being the Jewish religion and the Hebrew scriptures and all of their tradition. That is the root of the tree. So if you, as a Gentile, being grafted in as a wild olive tree into the tame olive tree that is Israel, don't start thinking you're better than the Jewish people because you, as a grafted in branch, don't support the root. The root supports you. It goes on. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Now he's talking about the tame olive tree, i.e. Israel, having its branches broken off so that the Gentile branch from the wild olive tree can be grafted in. Is this sounding familiar to anybody? Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity. But toward thee, goodness, if thou continue in his goodness. Otherwise, thou also shalt be cut off. Literally, cut off the tree, the same way as a branch would be cut off. And they also, once again referring to Israel, and they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, if they come around to believing in Jesus, right? Israel shall be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. They've been broken off. They've been taken somewhere else. They've been created into a tree somehow, and now they're being brought back and grafted into the original tree. This is exactly like Jacob chapter 5. For if thou wert cut out of the olive tree, you Gentiles, which is wild by nature, and wert grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which be the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? So that is the second antecedent for Jacob chapter 5 and the allegory of the olive tree. You can see there are a great many details from Romans 11 that get replicated in Jacob chapter 5. Antecedent number 3, this is from 1 Nephi chapter 10. We're now in the Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith had dictated and or translated, created in some way prior to Jacob chapter 5. And there are a number of antecedents to Jacob 5 in those preceding chapters. First off, 1 Nephi chapter 10, this is going to be antecedent number 3, starting with verse 12. Yea, even my father, this is Nephi speaking, so he's talking about Lehi. Yea, even my father spake much concerning the Gentiles, and also concerning the house of Israel, that they should be compared like unto an olive tree, whose branches should be broken off and should be scattered upon all the face of the earth. This is exactly what we read about in the allegory that's going to come several chapters later in Jacob chapter 5. Remember, we're in 1 Nephi 10 now. Wherefore he said, it must needs be, Lehi said, it must needs be that we should be led with one accord into the land of promise, unto the fulfilling of the word of the Lord, that we should be scattered upon all the face of the earth. And after the house of Israel should be scattered, they should be gathered together again. Or in fine, after the Gentiles had received the fullness of the gospel, the natural branches of the olive tree, or the remnants of the house of Israel, should be grafted in, or come to the knowledge of the true Messiah, their Lord and their Redeemer. You see, even before we get to Jacob chapter 5, we're finding all these elements of the Jacob 5 allegory occurring not only in the New Testament, but also in the Book of Mormon itself. It is being germinated in the mind of the author. And ultimately, when we get to the point of Jacob chapter 5, this germination will take all these parts and put them together into an elaborate allegory. So this is 1 Nephi chapter 10, the third antecedent. The fourth antecedent is now 1 Nephi chapter 15. When you start looking for this, you see that over and over again, even in the Book of Mormon, elements of the allegory of the olive tree are in abundance before we get to Jacob chapter 5. Now we're in 1 Nephi chapter 15 and verse 7, which says, and they said, this would be Laman and Lemuel, behold, we cannot understand the words which our father hath spoken concerning the natural branches of the olive tree, and also concerning the Gentiles. And then in verses 12 and 13, Nephi's going to come to the rescue and help answer their questions. Behold, I say unto you, that the house of Israel was compared unto an olive tree by the Spirit of the Lord, which was in our father. And behold, are we not broken off from the house of Israel? Are we not the living incarnation of this parable that I'm going to get to in Jacob chapter 5? And are we not a branch of the house of Israel? And now the thing which our father meaneth concerning the grafting in of the natural branches through the fullness of the Gentiles is that in the latter days, when our seed shall have dwindled in unbelief, yea, for the space of many years and many generations after the Messiah shall be manifested in body unto the children of men, then shall the fullness of the gospel of the Messiah come unto the Gentiles, and from the Gentiles unto the remnant of our seed. And here we can see once again being prefigured elements from the Jacob 5 allegory of the olive tree, including the wild branches being grafted into the tame olive tree. So by way of the Gentiles, the gospel ends up being restored back to Israel and the originator of the covenant and the holders of the promises from God. Continuing in 1 Nephi 15, once again, this is still antecedent number 4. And at that day shall the remnant of our seed know that they are of the house of Israel, and that they are the covenant people of the Lord. And then shall they know and come to the knowledge of their forefathers, and also to the knowledge of the gospel of their Redeemer, which was ministered unto their fathers by him. Wherefore they shall come to the knowledge of their Redeemer, and the very points of his doctrine, that they may know how to come unto him and be saved. Verse 15. And then at that day will they not rejoice and give praise unto their everlasting God, their rock and their salvation? Yea, at that day will they not receive, see, it's highlighted here. That means to pay attention. Yea, at that day will they not receive the strength and nourishment from the true vine. Yes, nourishment is another one of those verbs that appears over and over again in Jacob 5. Yea, will they not come unto the true fold of God? So there he's mixing metaphors, but in the highlighted portion, it does talk about receiving strength and nourishment from the true vine. Continuing in First Nephi 15, behold, I say unto you, yea, they shall be remembered again among the house of Israel. They shall be grafted in. Once again, this symbolism of being grafted, being a natural branch of the olive tree into the true olive tree. So in the last days, the descendants of the Lamanites will be remembered and they will be grafted in to the true olive tree. Remember, they're the ones who got taken away from the true olive tree, which was on hard times in Act 1, and planted in various parts of the vineyard, far away, but still in the vineyard, i.e., the world. And then it goes through the process of being half good and half bad, the fruit on that tree. That's the Lamanites and the Nephites. And then later on, they come back and it's all bad. And then they go through that huge cross grafting program where they take branches from that tree, put it back in the original tree, and everything is hunky dory and everything's producing great fruit. That is the representation of what's being talked about here in First Nephi 15:16. They shall be grafted in, being a natural branch of the olive tree, into the true olive tree. And this is what our father meaneth, says Nephi about his dad Lehi. And he meaneth that it will not come to pass until after they are scattered by the Gentiles. And he meaneth that it shall come by way of the Gentiles, that the Lord may show his power unto the Gentiles, for the very cause that he shall be rejected of the Jews or of the house of Israel. So the Jews lose the gospel, and then it goes to the Gentiles, and then the Gentiles end up bringing it back to the Jews in the last days. Continuing in 1 Nephi 15, wherefore our father hath not spoken of our seed alone, but also of all the house of Israel. Remember, it wasn't just that one branch that was put in a plot of ground. It was several branches that were taken in the parable in Act 1. Remember the beginning, and planted in different parts of the vineyard. So this is not about our seed alone, but also of all the house of Israel, pointing to the covenant which should be fulfilled in the latter days, which covenant the Lord made to our father Abraham, saying, in thy seed shall all the kindreds of the earth be blessed. And it came to pass that I, Nephi, spake much unto them concerning these things. Yea, I spake unto them concerning the restoration of the Jews in the latter days, which is the entire point of the parable of the olive tree in Jacob 5. Now we go to antecedent number 5. We only have 2 left. This is actually a very short one, but I think it's important. It's one verse, and it's actually just the last part of that verse. It's in 2 Nephi chapter 9, verse 53. And behold, how great the covenants of the Lord, and how great his condescensions unto the children of men. And because of his greatness and his grace and mercy, he has promised unto us that our seed shall not utterly be destroyed according to the flesh, but that he would preserve them. And in future generations, they shall become a righteous branch unto the house of Israel. So once again, riffing on this idea that in the last days, the descendants of the Lamanites will be restored to the true fold of God, which is symbolized by being a branch broken off and now being restored, and then become a righteous branch unto the house of Israel. So that is that one. Here is the last antecedent that I have discovered, things that were in Joseph Smith's mind or possession prior to dictating Jacob chapter 5. Oh, and this is 2 Nephi chapter 15. Now, the interesting thing about this is that 2 Nephi 15 occurs around 23 chapters before Jacob 5. And 2 Nephi 15 is itself part of that huge block of Isaiah chapters that are being quoted in 2 Nephi. However, this particular chapter in 2 Nephi 15 quotes verbatim Isaiah chapter 5. And Isaiah chapter 5 from the Old Testament is itself a parable about an olive tree. So you have not only the parable from Luke, you also have the parable from Isaiah in the Old Testament. And this particular parable is going to be quoted in full not that long before Joseph Smith gets around to dictating Jacob chapter 5. So this is in addition to the antecedents that we've looked at before. And here's how it goes in 2 Nephi 15, once again quoting Isaiah 5. And then will I sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved, touching his vineyard. My well-beloved hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill, and he fenced it and gathered out the stones thereof, and planted it with the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it, and also made a winepress therein. And he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, I pray you, between me or betwixt me and my vineyard? What could have been done more to my vineyard? This is an expression taken directly out of Isaiah chapter 5 and put in Jacob chapter 5. What could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Wherefore, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, it brought forth wild grapes. And now go to, I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the hedge thereof, and it shall be eaten up. And I will break down the wall thereof, and it shall be trodden down. And I will lay it waste. It shall not be pruned nor digged, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. See the identification there? And the men of Judah, his pleasant plant. And he looked for judgment, and behold, oppression, for righteousness, but behold, a cry. So there's that identification, that critical identification between the vineyard and the house of Israel. And in other places, it's between the olive tree and the house of Israel. But for purposes of this parable, it makes it the vineyard itself. So there are 6 antecedents for Jacob's allegory of the olive tree. These antecedents are found in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and even in chapters of the Book of Mormon preceding the creation of Jacob chapter 5. These antecedents contain all the primary elements of Jacob's allegory. All the primary elements of Jacob's allegory are in these antecedents, including such specific and unusual language as cumbereth the ground and digging and dunging. The surprise isn't that there is a huge parable about a wild olive tree in Jacob 5. The surprise would be if it were not there. It would be like having 6 antecedents leading up to an event, but the event never happens. That's how strong the case is from these antecedents, in my mind at least. The purpose of Jacob's allegory is to take the established elements of the scattering and gathering of Israel, symbolized by the tame olive tree, and then to elaborate upon it to include symbolisms of the Nephites and the Lamanites. He's taking these other allegories and assembling them, but the other allegories just talk about the scattering and gathering of Israel. Of course, they don't have anything about the Lamanites and the Nephites in the biblical parables because they knew nothing of the Lamanites and the Nephites or of the Book of Mormon. So what Joseph Smith is doing is he's taking these established elements and he is building a parable that starts with the scattering and gathering of Israel. And then he adds in the Lamanites and the Nephites as one of these branches broken off the original olive tree, which is getting old and decayed, and planted in a distant part of the vineyard, and then grows up. And then it has 2 different kinds of fruit. There's good and there's bad. And then later on, it's all bad. And then later on, they take the branches from that tree as well as other trees in this huge cross-grafting project. Take branches of the Nephite or Lamanite tree, take it back to the original tree, plant it in, it grows and produces great fruit. That is the restoration of the Lamanites to the true house of Israel in the last days. And this is what Joseph Smith is doing. He's taking an established parable from the Bible with established elements and simply using those same elements and elaborating upon them to include the Nephites and the Lamanites in a much larger, more sprawling parable in Jacob chapter 5. So once again, the purpose of Jacob's allegory is to take the established elements of the scattering and gathering of Israel, symbolized by the tame olive tree, and then to elaborate upon it to include symbolisms of the Nephites and the Lamanites. As I said, that's not that difficult. The over-elaboration of this theme yields an allegory that simultaneously produces the longest chapter in the Book of Mormon, as well as an allegory too complicated for any real use. I mean, when was the last time you heard this allegory from Jacob 5 used to illustrate anything? It is too cumbersome. The allegory itself that talks about cumbering the ground itself is too cumbersome for any real use. We have parables in the New Testament which are short and pithy, and those get used all the time. This is not short and pithy. This is long, drawn out, and cumbersome. And as a result, it never gets used for anything really. In fact, the only thing it gets used for is to be read every 4 years when we come back to the Book of Mormon and have to read it because it's part of the curriculum. And then we have to have programs about it produced by the church to try and explain what the heck is being talked about because it's so complicated. Okay, not really useful. And by the way, let me just mention briefly about this elaboration. I've talked about this before. This seems to have been one of Joseph's gifts is elaborating upon a text or an idea or a concept. We've seen in 2nd Nephi chapter 27, I believe it is. Yes, it is 2nd Nephi 27, where in that chapter it takes one or two verses from Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 29, it takes one or two verses and then elaborates and elaborates upon those ideas until it fills a complete chapter. This is the kind of elaboration that Joseph Smith is capable of. It seems to have been one of his gifts. And I see the same kind of elaboration as we saw in 2nd Nephi 27 with Isaiah, going on now with this parable in Jacob chapter 5. He has the basic elements, the basic language, and the basic idea, and he's going to elaborate upon it and continue elaborating upon it until he's managed to elaborate it so much that it's the longest chapter in the Book of Mormon. Now, just one more antecedent I want to mention, and that's from the parable itself, where it says in Act 3, remember, that there's a huge cross-grafting program is commenced with branches from the mother tree grafted into other trees and branches of all the other trees being grafted again into the mother tree. This is also something that has an antecedent in the Book of Mormon itself. And what I'm talking about here is 2nd Nephi chapter 29, where what is being represented here is almost certainly talked about before the parable itself is written and therefore gets incorporated symbolically into the parable. 2nd Nephi 29, 12, 13, and 14. For behold, I shall speak unto the Jews, and they shall write it. And I shall also speak unto the Nephites, and they shall write it. And I shall also speak unto the other tribes of the house of Israel, which I have led away. Remember those branches? And they shall write it. And I shall also speak unto all nations of the earth, and they shall write it. 13. And it shall come to pass that the Jews shall have the words of the Nephites, and the Nephites shall have the words of the Jews, and the Nephites and the Jews shall have the words of the lost tribes of Israel, and the lost tribes of Israel shall have the words of the Nephites and the Jews. This is this cross-grafting that's being talked about, or at least symbolically represented now in Jacob 5 from this idea, which is enunciated in 2nd Nephi 29, just about 8 chapters or so prior to the dictation of Jacob chapter 5. And it shall come to pass that my people, which are of the house of Israel, shall be gathered. And unfortunately, the processing of that slide makes it so I can't actually read that off the slide. But good thing to know, I've got my Book of Mormon here, 2nd Nephi 29. And it shall come to pass that my people, which are of the house of Israel, shall be gathered home unto the lands of their possessions. And my word also shall be gathered in one. Yep. And I will show unto them that fight against my word and against my people who are of the house of Israel that I am God, etc. So we have this idea of gathering of people, gathering of his word, and gathering of all the branches and all the cross-grafting that's going on, as talked about here. I feel pretty darn confident in 2nd Nephi chapter 29. The similarities are just too close for comfort. So that concludes our analysis of the 6 antecedents of the olive tree allegory in Jacob chapter 5. There has been of late a great deal of scholarship on the issue, produced mostly by the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies. When I say of late, I'm talking about 30 years ago. 1994, Farm Symposium, completely dealing with Jacob 5 and the olive tree allegory. And that is a big book. I had that book at one time. I don't know where it's gotten to, actually. I did have that book. I did read it. I read all the essays in it. And this is a book of over 600 pages, all dealing with this allegory. Now, there is a common apologetic argument which I have heard and which maybe you have heard, and I want to prepare you for so that you will be able to respond to it if you so desire. Here is the common apologetic argument. The olive tree allegory in Jacob chapter 5 exactly mirrors olive tree husbandry in the ancient Middle East. Olive trees don't grow in New York, and therefore, how could Joseph Smith have known so as to get all the details right? That is the common apologetic argument. It is based upon not giving you all of the evidence, which I will do right now. Here's a response to this apologetic. Joseph Smith did get everything right about the olive tree allegory, except for the things he got wrong. And the things he got wrong are 2 primary glaring things. The first is that olive trees do not grow well in a poor spot of ground. And number 2, you cannot graft wild olive tree branches into a tame olive tree and get good fruit. Those are 2 elements from the allegory of the olive tree. And this is why when I was going through the allegory itself, or at least the overview, I told you to remember that part about trees being planted in poor spots of ground and doing very well and producing wonderful fruit, at least in the second act of that four-act play, I believe it was. And the second one, you cannot graft wild olive tree branches into a tame olive tree and get good fruit. That one is one of the primary drivers of the plot in the allegory of the wild olive tree branches being grafted into the tame olive tree and producing good fruit. That does not happen in real horticulture. For this proposition, I am going to cite no other than a person who is a horticulturalist, or at least he was a botanist. This comes from a book published in 1990. It is published by BYU, the Religious Studies Center. It is titled The Book of Mormon, Jacob Through Words of Mormon. It's a collection of essays as well, To Learn with Joy. And it is an article in this book titled Botanical Comparisons in the Allegory of the Olive Tree by Wilford M. Hess. So who is this Wilford M. Hess individual? There he is. He's since deceased now. But if you can see this, this has articles by this author, and it has that one article. That's the one article that's on his webpage that he wrote for this volume that we'll be talking about. And above it, in the brief description of Wilford M. Hess, it says he was a professor of botany and range science at Brigham Young University. So we would expect, number one, that he might know what he's talking about, botanically speaking. And number two, he's going to give things the best spin he possibly can because he's a faithful member of the church and a professor at BYU. But let's see what he says here in his article. Under the heading, Examples of Interpretations That Seem to Violate Botanical Rules, he lists first, wild branches can yield tame fruit. Now that's an example of an interpretation, or it's actually the straightforward symbology of the parable, but he's saying this violates botanical rules. The idea that wild branches can yield tame fruit is a violation of botanical rules, as we can see from what follows. Therefore, if a wild olive branch is grafted onto a tame olive tree, as it says in the parable, that branch and all of its growth will retain the same genetics. It will remain wild and will produce only wild or small-seeded bitter fruit, fruit of low quality. Although the size may increase due to better nutrition, that branch will never have the genetic potential of the branches from domesticated trees. So what he's saying here is that when the olive tree allegory in Jacob 5 says that wild branches are grafted into a tame olive tree and they produce good or tame fruit, that is a violation of known and understood botanical principles. And the second violation in Jacob chapter 5 of botanical rules is that good plants can emerge from poor soil. So those are the two, and that's why I put them in that list before that had the two things in the parable that do not happen. And now I am citing to an individual who is a faithful member of the church and a professor of botany and range science at BYU who says exactly the same thing. Don't take my word for it. Take his word for it. He would not be saying this unless it were absolutely true, because it would be against his interest to say it as a believing and faithful Latter-day Saint. So the response to this apologetic could be as follows. You're right. Joseph Smith did get everything right about the olive tree allegory, except for the things he got wrong. Number one, olive trees do not grow well in a poor spot of ground. And number two, you cannot graft wild olive tree branches into a tame olive tree and get good fruit. And, by the way, and the things that Joseph Smith got right in the allegory, he would presumably have known because he was a farmer. I mean, he's raised as a farm boy in a farming family. Are you telling me he'd never done or heard about grafting branches from one tree into another? The surprise isn't what he gets right. The surprise is what he gets wrong. And what he gets wrong is a dead indicator that this parable does not come from the ancient world, but comes out of Joseph Smith's own imagination, as we can tell from the fingerprints left at the scene of the crime, from the 6 antecedents that we went over to this parable found in the Old Testament and the New Testament and in earlier chapters of the Book of Mormon. I wanted to throw in here an interesting verse from Jacob 5, which suggests that perhaps this olive tree in Jacob 5 really is the tree of life that was witnessed by Lehi in his dream in 1 Nephi 8. You'll remember in 1 Nephi 8, verse 12, Lehi describes the tree as follows, "And as I partook of the fruit thereof, it filled my soul with exceeding great joy. Wherefore I began to be desirous that my family should partake of it also, for I knew that it was desirable above all other fruit." It was desirable above all other fruit. Jacob 5:61 has this to say, which sounds interestingly similar. Wherefore, go to and call servants that we may labor diligently with our might in the vineyard, that we may prepare the way, that I may bring forth again the natural fruit. Which natural fruit is what? It is good and the most precious above all other fruit. See, that's the exact same idea between 1 Nephi 8:12, for I knew that it was desirable above all other fruit, and Jacob chapter 5:61 talking about this olive tree. The fruit is most precious above all other fruit. So there's a suggestion here and a hint that Lehi's tree of life in his dream is the same tree as Jacob's allegory of the olive tree, which would lend itself to the interpretation that the tree of life as seen by Lehi is in fact an olive tree, or was supposed to be an olive tree. Going on, there is a pattern of quoting and expounding Isaiah that I've talked about a little bit in prior episodes. I want to touch on it now because it figures here very interestingly. Now, there's a pattern going on in the first books of the Book of Mormon, which is one of quoting Isaiah and then expounding on Isaiah, right? In the first one, this happens 3 times. The first example is Nephi quotes Isaiah chapter 48 and 49. He quotes that in 1 Nephi 20 and 21, and then he expounds on Isaiah in 1 Nephi 22. So he quotes Isaiah in 2 chapters, then he expounds on that in 1 chapter. The next example is Jacob quotes Isaiah 50 through 52, 1 through 2, in 2 Nephi chapter 7 and 8. And then he expounds on Isaiah in 2 Nephi chapters 9 and 10, the same pattern you see. And it happens again, the third example being Nephi quoting Isaiah chapters 2 through 14. That's that huge block of Isaiah in 2 Nephi chapters 12 through 24. And then Nephi expounds on Isaiah for the rest of his book of 2 Nephi in 2 Nephi chapters 25 through 33. This is the pattern of quoting and expounding Isaiah. Now, a primary theme of all 3 discourses on Isaiah are the scattering and gathering of Israel. That is because this is a primary theme of the Isaiah chapters that are quoted, but it is also the primary theme of the olive tree allegory that follows in Jacob chapter 5. And one of the Isaiah chapters quoted, Isaiah 5, contains an allegory of the tame olive tree, which was reproduced in 2 Nephi 15. We read that one, which may have formed an obvious catalyst for the extended olive tree allegory in Jacob chapter 5. So, in concluding our discussion of the olive tree allegory and how it was that Joseph Smith came up with that allegory, number 1, in light of the 6 scriptural precedents for the olive tree allegory, the surprise would not be that the Book of Mormon contains such an allegory, but if it did not contain such an allegory, all these antecedents are leading somewhere, and that somewhere is this allegory in Jacob 5. If it were not there, you would have all these indicators pointing to something that never showed up. Number 2, the olive tree allegory does not contain farming techniques unknown to Joseph Smith. And he gets it dead wrong on 2 techniques mentioned in the allegory relating to olive trees. Number 1, planting in bad soil can produce a good olive tree. That's something he got wrong. That's something that's in the allegory, and it's something that violates botanical principles. And number 2, the second thing he got wrong was the idea that grafting wild olive tree branches into a good olive tree will produce good fruit. That doesn't happen. Number 3, the sermons in 1st and 2nd Nephi, based on Isaiah, those 3 sermons that we just talked about, have a common theme of scattering and gathering of Israel. Joseph Smith took this repeated idea in the Book of Mormon and elaborated on the olive tree allegory precedents. Remember, those 6 precedents or antecedents, specifically in order to include, number 1, the Book of Mormon narrative, the Nephites and the Lamanites, as well as 2, Joseph's understanding of apostasy from the church Christ established and its restoration to the Jews by way of the Gentiles in the last days, which is what the entire parable in Jacob 5 is about. So this is how I envision Joseph Smith coming up with this Jacob chapter 5 allegory. It was a combination of antecedents together with Joseph Smith's beliefs that he then elaborated into a very, very long parable. In fact, so long that it's called an allegory, and in fact, so long an allegory that it doesn't get used at all in the church because it's simply too cumbersome for any real teaching purposes. I want to add one other thing to this discussion. It doesn't have anything to do with the olive tree. We're done with that. But I had mentioned in an earlier podcast a strange verse that I came upon in this reading of the Book of Mormon. I've read the Book of Mormon over 20 times, probably closer to 30. I'm reading it again this year for Sunday school. And this time, for the first time, this verse jumped out at me in 2nd Nephi chapter 6. The words of Jacob, the brother of Nephi, which he spake unto the people of Nephi. And then it goes on with the sermon of Jacob, right? Behold, my beloved brethren, I, Jacob, having been called of God, etc. And my question was, who was it who wrote verse 1? Who wrote this introduction? Remember, these are the small plates of Nephi. They are self-contained. They were never edited by Mormon. He simply found them when his abridgment was complete and added them into the record because the voice of God whispered to him that it would be a good idea for him to do so, right? You remember the story. So we are used to seeing these kinds of third-party God's view comments being written in the narrative from Mosiah to the end of the Book of Mormon, when they would be explained by Mormon as the editor and abridger, making these comments to introduce them to the reader. That makes sense. What does not make sense is that they appear in the small plates of Nephi, where Mormon says he didn't do any abridging. So this is not written by Mormon. Who is it written by? Everything else is first person. The words of Jacob, the brother of Nephi, which he spake unto the people of Nephi. Who wrote that? We talked about it before. It didn't seem to make sense that Nephi would write it, because if Nephi wrote it, he would say, the words of Jacob, my brother, not the brother of Nephi. He wouldn't refer to himself in the third person, we would think. And Jacob should not be referring to himself in the third person either. The words of Jacob, my words. This is what I taught. This is what we see everywhere else in the small plate section of the Book of Mormon, except for here. But then I read on and I found another example of the exact same thing. So I found now not just the one example, but two examples. And here's the second example. It's in the book of Jacob. It's chapter 2. It's verse 1. Once again, small plates. The words which Jacob, the brother of Nephi, spake unto the people of Nephi after the death of Nephi. It's definitely not Nephi writing it now. Nephi's dead and gone. And it sure doesn't seem like it's Jacob anymore. Because once again, why is he referring to himself in the third person? Let's go over the options. We know it can't be Nephi because he's referred to in the third person, and in the second instance that we just quoted, he's dead by then. Number 2, it is either Jacob or Joseph writing this third person introduction to Jacob's speech. Does the fact it occurs only with Jacob provide a clue, or is it just a coincidence? I.e., is this something exclusive to Jacob? Does Jacob write it? But why would Jacob write it in 2 Nephi 6 before Jacob has the plates? Remember that first example? Why would Jacob be writing anything in those plates before he has them? They are in Nephi's possession, and he's the one who's writing stuff down. So let's be clear here. In 2 Nephi chapter 6, where it says the words of Jacob, the brother of Nephi, which he spake unto the people of Nephi, we know that's not Jacob writing it. Why? Because Nephi's writing it. The plates are in Nephi's possession. They haven't been handed off to Jacob as of 2 Nephi chapter 6. So therefore, we know it's not Jacob who's writing this in 2 Nephi chapter 6. The second instance in the book of Jacob chapter 2, we know that Nephi's not writing it because he's dead. So if Jacob isn't writing the first one and Nephi's not writing the second one, even though they're identical, what that leaves on the table is Joseph Smith. The cheese stands alone. This was added by Joseph Smith, not thinking of the fact that it does not belong here in the small plate section. He's already gone through the rest of the Book of Mormon. Remember the Mosiah priority. Everything else has been translated before he gets back to the small plate section and comes around the horn and starts again at 1 Nephi and goes up to the beginning of the Book of Mosiah. He is used to putting in these editorial comments in places where they are explicable as being put in there by the abridger, who was Mormon, right? But they don't belong in the small plates. And yet in these two instances, Joseph Smith included them in such a way that we know it wasn't Nephi and it wasn't Jacob. So by the process of elimination, it appears that Joseph Smith is the one who wrote both of these introductory third person verses in the small plates of Nephi. Well, that is about all for tonight. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of the allegory of the olive tree in Jacob chapter 5 and how it is that Joseph Smith came up with this olive tree allegory in the first place. It's not as amazing as one might think at first blush, and it's certainly not as amazing as Mormon apologists would have you believe when they say that Joseph Smith got absolutely everything right in ancient Middle Eastern olive horticulture. Please hit the like button. Please hit subscribe. Please share this with family and friends. And thank you to all of you who have gone to radiofreemormon.org and made a donation, whether a one-time donation or a continuing donation. Thank you so much. Your support keeps Radio Free Mormon broadcasting behind enemy lines. Until next time, this is Radio Free Mormon, signing off the air.